Welcome again to our journey together. Last Sunday, in our conversation on Sunday morning, we really focused on the whole issue of the call and a very personal relationship in terms of faith. And as we talked about the call, I was continually reminded of what my definition of the call is, and that is what was at the top of the page last week. The experience of God's love is how I would describe the call in my life or in the life of other people. Now, the call comes in different ways. The experience of God's love comes in different ways. Some people have actually heard a voice of God. It's not been my experience, but many have had that experience. Others have experienced God's love through the voice of another person. Others have experienced God's love through a sign, a rainbow, for instance, a miracle of nature. Others out of an experience of the end of conflict, for instance, has been sometimes sort of an experience through which they experience God's love. But however that comes, that's the foundation of faith. Now, we talked last week that for some can interpret that as being chosen. Others can experience that as being sent. But that's where we were last week, and what I want to do this week is to back up into this, into the foundation and into the call. Because I believe that experience of God's love is my call, but it can also be referred to as my vocation. Now, vocation is an interesting word. If you get back to the Latin root word of vocation, what does it mean? It means call. And so what I want to do is unpack this. And now, pardon me, but that's supposed to be sort of like a heart. And it really isn't one, but it's sort of like a heart. And it's got a point on it for a purpose that we'll get to later. But that becomes the very heart of a person in their journey of life and in their journey of faith. That becomes the commitment to make the world a better place, to make God's world a better place. That's the heart that enables that. The experience of God's love is what transforms us into a commitment to make the world a better place. And I think I can unpack this the best maybe through a short trip into my own journey. The first time I experienced God's love that I can remember so vividly that really transformed my life was my, 6th, 7th grade church school teacher. His name was Mr. Barnhart. Mr. Barnhart was a terrible church school teacher by any standard. He didn't know what that meant. My parents were both school teachers, so I sort of had a hunch of what it meant to be a good teacher. But Mr. Barnhart failed the test, okay? And so therefore, because of my age and the age of others in the class, we responded to Mr. Barnhart out of some disrespect. We were ornery, and frankly, we didn't pay any attention. And I don't know what brought us to this point one Sunday when we weren't behaving very well and Mr. Barnhart was trying to control us. The question was asked him, Mr. Barnhart, this is so hard for you. Why are you doing this? And he looked at us, and I felt like he was looking right at me, and rightfully so. Tears flowed out of his eyes. And he said, I really love you boys. Well, my orneriness melted. Our classroom behavior was changed. He was the same teacher that wasn't very effective, but we listened, we respected him, and moving away from that experience, I wanted to be like Mr. Barnhart. I wanted to love. It wasn't that I hadn't been loved. My parents loved me. My extended family loved me. But this was different. Mr. Barnhart loved me. And because of that, he was willing to go through an excruciating, painful experience of being my Sunday school teacher, which was harder for him than it was for me. And that was the first time I experienced love that was different than my parents' love. It was, as I look back, my first vivid experience of God's love. And that became my heart, if you will, of my journey. Now, in my journey as a teenager and young adult, I considered several occupations. I considered teaching. My parents were teachers. 4 months from college graduation was sort of trying to decide of going on for a doctorate in history or going to seminary. I considered coaching. After I was in seminary, I came close to accepting a job in coaching, and I will always remember that. And that a coaching friend of mine, a mentor, said to me, "Bruce, you will reach more lives and you'll touch more lives as a coach than you ever will as a preacher." Looking back on it, I think he's probably right. And I considered preaching, and I finally decided to become an ordained person in the church, because I felt like my gifts and who I was could match that occupation. But you know something? I never felt called to be a preacher. I never felt called to be a coach. I never felt called to be a teacher, because my call was more basic than that. Because my experience was that I could take that heart, my vocation, my experience of God's love, and I could carry that heart into any occupation I chose. I could carry that heart into any family relationship that I created. I could carry that into my citizenship to make the world a better place. I ran for the school board when I was in Derby and was elected, and that was taking my vocation into my citizenship and into my relationships, daily relationships with people. I could take my call, my experience of God's love into any of those, because the call, the experience of God's love is the very heart and the very foundation of life. You know, as a consequence of my journey, I've been privileged to watch a lot of people. You know, I've seen factory laborers, workers who had an experience of God's love, and they had an incredible impact upon others. I've known persons that have never received a paycheck in their lives who have had a profound influence on others because of their heart that they took into their life. But you know something? I've also known persons who were in professions like the ministry, who functioned in the ministry, but they didn't have the heart of the experience of God's love taken into the ministry. And I've watched people try to relate to them as a pastor without the heart of the experience of God's love. And those persons were often self-serving rather than other-serving because they didn't have the heart of the call, the heart of the vocation, the heart of the experience of God's love. In summary, it's pretty simple for me, and that is the foundation of faith is the experience of God's love, the call. It can be expressed in all of our life and is not dependent upon any factor in our lives. You can take one's occupation away from them, but if they've got the heart of God's love, that doesn't make any difference. They're still going to be that same person. You can take relationships away from people, but if they've got the heart, it doesn't really make a difference because that heart is intact. And so as we choose our occupation, as we choose our family relationships, as we choose our citizenship, as we choose our relationships, remember, the foundation of faith is the experience of God's love. That's our heart that goes with us wherever we find ourselves. So, to think about this, maybe a couple, 3 questions might be helpful. One is, what, in your experience of God's love, what are the experiences that really formed you as a person of faith? Who are the Mr. Barnharts in your love? Where were the signs, the experiences, and maybe even the voice of God? Another question, in our recent 3-month experience of the pandemic, what are the stories you've seen of a person's vocation, of a person's heart, having made the world a better place? And the final question, what are your experiences as you try to relate to other people on the basis of occupation, family, citizenship, or relationships without experiencing their heart? Is it different than when you've had the privilege of experiencing their heart? I hope you enjoy thinking about these things.